At 1:45 a.m. on October 13, 1984, 20-year-old Angela Samota called her boyfriend Ben McCall in a panic. She told him on the phone that a strange man was at her door and was asking to use her phone and bathroom. She then ended the call abruptly. Who was this strange man who had been outside her place? What could have led to this brutal murder? Welcome back to Mysterious 7, where we shed light on under-the-radar cases from across the globe. Today we'll be looking at a case that was solved after 20 years due to the persistence and dedication of the victim's best friend. Let's dive right into this mystery without any further ado. Our case today takes us to Dallas, Texas, the third largest city in Texas and the fourth largest metropolitan area in the United States. Dallas is a commercial and cultural hub of the region and has many attractions and cultural sites to explore. In the Arts District, the Dallas Museum of Art and the Crow Collection of Asian Art cover thousands of years of art history. With a 2020 census population of 1.3 million, it's the 9th most populous city in the U.S. Frank and Betty Ruth Samota were overjoyed when they had their 5th child, a daughter, whom they named Angela Marie Samota on September 19, 1964. Born in Alameda, California, Angela grew up with her 4 older siblings and loving mother. Her father left the family soon after she was born, so he never played much of a role in her life. Growing up and in her later teens, most people would describe Angela as pleasant and intelligent. She excelled at academics. After high school, Angela began studying electrical engineering and computer science at the Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. She was one of the few women at the time in the computer science department. Angela was also a member of the Zeta Tau Alpha sorority. In 1984, she was dating a man named Ben McCall, who worked a construction job in the same area. It was also here in Dallas that on her first day of university in 1982, she'd meet her best friend and roommate, Sheila. They were polar opposites, with Angela putting a lot of emphasis on her studies and frequently staying up late into the night to study. She was also vivacious and friendly, and often the center of attention. Sheila, on the other hand, was dyslexic and struggling to get through college, and in no way as outgoing as Angela. But both of them grew up without fathers in their lives, and they bonded over this shared experience. After the first semester, when things were a little strained between them, they became the best of friends. In 1984, both girls were entering their junior year in college and were excited for what the future could hold. Sadly, this was a future Angela would never get to see. It was October 12, 1984. Russell Buchanan and Anita Kadala, 2 of Angela's friends, visited the state fair with her where they had a wonderful time on the rides and other attractions. They then went to a popular nightclub called the Rio Room Dance Club. They spent a while there dancing and enjoying themselves. With Angela being her usual social self, she knew most of the people at the club and was making conversation with almost all of them. When they began to tire, she took her 2 friends home and dropped each of them off at their respective homes. Russell lived on Matilda Street in Lower Greenville, which was a 5-minute walk from Samota's condo on Amesbury Drive. After dropping them off, she paid her boyfriend Ben McCall a quick visit, as he'd not been able to join them due to work obligations the following morning. She then went back home to her own apartment to get some sleep. At 1:45 a.m. on October 13, 1984, Angela called her boyfriend in a slight panic. She said that there was a strange man she did not recognize outside her apartment, asking to be let in so he could use her bathroom and phone. The exact time the man arrived at her apartment is unknown. It's also not known if she let him in. On the phone call with Ben, she sounded quite panicked, and she ended the call abruptly, saying she'd call him back. This was the last time Ben would hear her voice. Ben called her back again and again, hoping and praying that she'd just answer the phone so his fears would subside. But there was no response to any of his calls from Angela. Fearing the worst, he got into his car and drove over to her place to make sure that she was all right. When he reached her place, he found her apartment door locked, and despite knocking on it repeatedly, there was no answer from within. Frustrated and worried, he called the police, who showed up at 2:17 a.m., less than an hour after Angela's initial call to Ben. The police and Ben broke down the locked door into her apartment, but nothing could prepare them for what they were about to see inside. The detectives, along with Ben, entered Angela's apartment expecting the worst after she'd been unresponsive to his calls and their repeated banging on the door. But when they finally gained entrance, the sight they saw was much worse than they had even imagined. Angela was lying naked on her bed, covered in blood and multiple stab wounds. One of the officers in the initial investigation, when describing the crime scene, said it looked almost like she'd been butchered. The viciousness with which she'd been attacked and the multiple stab wounds made detectives think that she'd likely been killed by someone who knew her, as the rage behind the attack indicated a personal motive. They took her body away for an autopsy and began the investigation. The first person police spoke to was her boyfriend, Ben McCall, who was already present at her apartment. Police initially suspected him because he didn't join Angela and her friends for their night out. However, when they later cross-checked with his employers in regards to his early morning job, they found that he was telling the truth and that he had, in fact, been at home when the crime occurred. He was soon cleared as a suspect, and police shifted their attention elsewhere. Meanwhile, the news of her murder spread across the university like wildfire. Everyone who heard about it was shocked that someone so joyful could have been killed in such a violent manner. No one had any idea who could have done such a thing. When Angela's best friend, Sheila heard the news, it broke her heart. She was not at college at the time, but at home with her family, and remembers screaming in pain when she learned what had happened. She made the decision not to return to university, but to dedicate herself to figuring out what had happened to her best friend. When the autopsy reports for Angela came back, they stated that before she was stabbed so violently, she'd been sexually assaulted by whomever had killed her. Police were also able to recover DNA from her body, from a rape kit test they conducted, and from skin found under her fingernails. The fact that there was DNA under her fingernails also showed that Angela had attempted to fight off whomever had tragically taken her life. However, even though they were able to recover DNA, at the time in 1984, there was very little the police could do with this evidence. It was stored away in the hopes that it would be useful later in the investigation. Police once again shifted their attention to their next suspect, Russell Buchanan, the male friend who had accompanied Angela to the fair and the nightclub on the night she'd been killed. Now, Russell Buchanan was an architect who was 23 years old at the time, which was a few years older than Angela and her friends, and he was already established in his profession. Angela, who was great at networking, may have realized that having him as a connection could be beneficial for her in the future, which could be one reason why she struck up a friendship with him. Russell was a bit shy, which is why she had invited him to go dancing with her and her friend the night she was murdered. It was Angela's friend, Sheila, who told the police that Russell was someone who always gave off a suspicious vibe to her and that something was not quite right with him. The police had already questioned him extensively, and he had stuck to his story that Angela had dropped him at home on the night of the murder and he'd been asleep all night. The police, however, wanted to be sure of this, so they asked Sheila if she would go for dinner with Russell and check to see if he told her the same story he told them. Sheila agreed, and when she did, Russell told her the same story, which she repeated to the police. Even after this, investigators were still suspicious of Buchanan and had him come down and take a lie detector test, which he also cleared. Finally, Russell, tired of being doubted, decided to stop cooperating with the police and hired one of the best defense attorneys in the area, known as Richard Racehorse Haynes. The problem with this was that most people who hired Richard were usually guilty of the things they were being accused of, which didn't help Russell's case at all at the time. However, in this case, there was no physical evidence to prove Russell was involved at all, and police could never charge him. This was also the last suspect they had, and after this, they began to run out of leads to chase. Eventually, the case went cold. For years after the case went cold, it seemed like all hope was lost and Angela Samota might never see justice in her case. Law enforcement had tried their best, but with nothing tangible to show for their efforts, Angela's case eventually faded into the background for them. But there was one person who never gave up: Angela's best friend, Sheila Wysocki. Sheila never fully recovered from Angela's death. She'd not been in college when she heard the news, and she chose never to return afterwards. She moved in with her mother and spent months trying to come to terms with the loss. She also was persistent in wanting to know who the culprit could have been. She followed up with the detectives who worked the case constantly, asking if they had any new leads or information. She got to know the lead detective so well that she'd often meet him for drinks at bars around town to talk about the case and see if the police were any closer to solving it. When she got married 4 years after the murder in 1988, she even invited this lead detective to her wedding. That was how well she'd gotten to know him over the past few years. But after getting married, her new life began to take up more and more of her time. She had 2 sons, and raising them meant she had less time to dedicate to finding Angela's killer. She and her family moved to Tennessee, and she did her best to move on with her life. But she could never truly leave Angela in the past without knowing who her killer was. In 2004, 20 years after Angela's death, Sheila and her family had moved and were living in Tennessee. One evening, she was trying to do some work for her Bible study when she claimed to have an extraordinary experience. Being dyslexic, she was struggling with reading the tiny print in her Bible. When she looked to the right, she claims to have had a vision of Angela, clear as day. There she was, her best friend whom she had lost 2 decades earlier. Sheila initially thought she was dreaming, but later interpreted this to be a vision sent from God. There were no words spoken between her and the specter she saw. However, she says that after the experience, she once again knew what her purpose in life was. Seeing Angela like this was her sign to continue pushing to find the identity of the person who had taken her best friend from her. Moments after the vision had ended, she picked up her phone and called the Dallas Police Department, ready to try her best again. When she first got through to Dallas PD in 2004, she asked to speak to the Cold Case Division and got the disappointing response that there was no designated cold case unit at that time, and she'd just have to speak to homicide. Undeterred, Sheila asked for the detective who she had known all those years ago and left him a message, hoping that he'd get back to her. Over the next few days, she tried to call him again and again, but got no response. The detective never returned any of her phone calls, and according to Sheila, over a period of time, I called probably 700 times. Most people would have given up with this lack of a response, but not Sheila. She began to conduct her own research into the case. She looked into all the cases of sexual assault that had taken place around the time Angela was murdered. She recorded their locations, the time they took place, and the suspects police identified during those investigations. She continued to badger the Dallas PD in her efforts to have them reopen the case. One day when she was speaking to the head of security for her community about how the police were constantly ignoring her calls, he told her that she'd make a great private investigator, PI, and suddenly Sheila had another idea. She thought that surely the police would not ignore her efforts if she became a PI, but she was wrong. She spent the next few months preparing for the exam that PIs need to complete in order to become certified. She learned about cyberbullying, copyright laws, and cheating spouses. She received training from security officers in and around her community, and finally, in late 2004, she obtained her license. She thought that this would mean the police would finally sit down and talk to her, but sadly, they couldn't have cared less. Yet Sheila was still determined to not give up, and she continued to push the Dallas PD to get the case reopened. Finally, a few months later, after Sheila's persistence in hounding the police department for answers, they gave in and reopened the case. A new female detective, Linda Crum, was assigned, and she finally met with Sheila to discuss the details of the investigation. In this meeting, Sheila learned a shocking piece of information. She was told that the police still had the DNA from the original investigation that had been obtained from the rape kit test and from under Angela's fingernails. Sheila was stunned. Whenever she'd inquired about this evidence before, she'd been told that all the DNA evidence from the original investigation had been destroyed in a flood in the evidence lockup sometime in the 1990s. Sheila was overjoyed to hear this news, as she knew this evidence would be key in solving the case, as DNA science was now much more developed than it had been at the time of the murder. She urged the Dallas police to put in a request to get the DNA tested. Finally, in 2008, the DNA was sent for testing to see if the profile could be matched to anyone in the system. It took over a year for the results to come back, but in 2009, Sheila received a call from Linda where she heard the 3 words she'd waited for all this time: "We got him." Sheila expected the next words to be Russell Buchanan, their friend and the prime suspect from all those years ago, but she was shocked to hear a name she was completely unfamiliar with, that of Donald Bess. Donald Bess, born in 1948, was a serial rapist who, at the time of Angela's murder, had been on parole after being sentenced to 25 years in prison for aggravated rape and aggravated kidnapping. He'd been charged in 1978, but was let out on parole in 1984, the same year he tragically took Angela's life. As fate would have it, a year after Angela's death in 1985, in a case unrelated to her murder, Bess was sentenced in Harris County, Texas, to life imprisonment for 1 count of aggravated rape, 1 count of aggravated kidnapping, and 1 count of sexual assault. He was still serving this life sentence in 2009 when he was identified as Angela's killer. In 2010, Bess again went on trial, this time for the murder of Angela Samota. Sheila Wysocki attended the trial to see the sentencing of the man who took her best friend from her. During the proceedings, various other women also came forward to testify that they'd also been sexually assaulted by Bess, showing a pattern of violent behavior towards women. His ex-wife, whom he'd been married to for 3 years from 1969 to 1972, also came forward and said that he'd abused her and their child during their marriage. On the basis of the DNA match from Angela's case, Bess was found guilty by the jury, and on June 8, 2010, he received the death sentence. On March 6, 2013, the appeal filed by Bess was rejected and the judgment of the trial court was upheld. He filed a certiorari petition to the Supreme Court in 2013, which was also denied, and in April 2016, the Texas Criminal Court of Appeals refused an appeal submitted by Bess and upheld the findings of the Dallas County Trial Court. However, Bess would never actually face the death sentence, as he died in prison from a heart attack on October 8, 2022, while awaiting execution. Sheila intended on retiring her private investigator's license after the case was solved, but she got an overwhelming number of requests when people heard of her dedication and persistence in this case and decided to continue practicing. She remains a private investigator to this day and stands as a symbol that anyone can uncover the truth if they're just willing to put in the effort to do so. When the police were unwilling to put in the effort to help her find justice for her friend, she stepped up and managed to do it herself. And there we have it, the tale of how a cold case was finally solved after over 2 decades, thanks to the victim's best friend refusing to give up on her. This case serves as an example of the potential of modern forensic technology and how it can be used to make breakthroughs in cases people thought were hopeless. But what do you think of this case? Isn't the love Sheila had for her best friend and the amount of effort she put in to make sure her case was never forgotten simply amazing? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed the video, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, stay safe and thanks for watching.